Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding. I'm an author but also a director of the centre. And today I am joined by a special guest from America, Lisa Edmonds, who is, well, best known to me for her Alice Worth's series. Now, before we talk about that, Lisa, perhaps you might want to take us on your own personal story of your journey to becoming an author. What happened before to get you to this point?
Well, both my parents were librarians, so I'll start with that. And when both your parents are librarians, you grow up in libraries, you read a
Yes.
ton. So from a very young age, my dad was also very nerdy, so I grew up watching reruns of the original Star Trek. So I grew up on science fiction and fantasy and mysteries. Started with Nancy Drew when I
Brilliant.
was little. And then in my teen years, I kind of graduated to cozy mysteries and hard-boiled detective fiction. And I especially really loved private investigator, but I also read a lot of police procedurals like Ed McBain. So I was reading a lot of Sue Grafton, who wrote the Alphabet Mysteries. I know that's a little bit out of the purview of Mythmakers, but and Sarah Paretsky, who wrote the V.I. Warshawski books. There
Oh,
was a
yeah.
movie made of that. So I just kind of read a lot of genre fiction. I kind of envisioned myself writing really science fiction. So it was a bit of a surprise that I started writing urban fantasy, but I discovered the genre through Kim Harrison's books, the Rachel Morgan Hollows books, and it was sort of like a gateway drug. Um, After that, I just started reading every urban fantasy series I could get my hands on. And it was like the perfect melding of the science fiction, the fantasy, and the mysteries. Because every book in urban fantasy tends to have some kind of mystery to solve. You know, what kind of
Mm.
creature is this? Who's causing all this disruption? Um, and then you have these wonderful characters that, you know, the typical urban fantasy heroine has a lot of snark. um, you know, she tends to be a self-rescuing princess, which is also a great creates great storylines. And I just love imagination, so I love the world building. So all that kind of came together, and a couple of years ago, I guess, well, it's been more than a couple of years ago now, but back in about 2015, I thought, well, maybe I could try my hand at this. So I, developed a character and a world, and and that's how it all got started.
Did your journey on the way include the J.D. Robb stories? Because they were one of my entryways into that kind of sci-fi police procedural. I've been following it all the way because I think she started writing those in the 90s, didn't she?
Hmm. Yeah, it's been
So
around a really long time. Yeah, for
incredibly
sure.
long-running series, but that was the thing that showed me the way that you could mash up genres of something which was familiar, contemporary police procedurals, and then put it 50 years in the future. I think the
Right.
only problem is we're catching up, aren't we, with the historical period she's chosen.
Well, and I also really like the Scandinavian sort of psychological thriller mysteries as
Mm.
well, like the Henning Mankell series,
Oh, yeah.
and oh gosh, the Kenneth they turned it into a TV series, Kenneth Branagh, um, and a bunch of other there's just nobody that does that dark psychological, really twisted mysteries like Norwegian and Swedish and Danish authors. So I feel like my series is like an amalgamation of all of that. Alice is a little bit Kinsey Milhone, who is Sue Grafton's PI, and a little bit Via Warshawski, but then also influenced by all the fantasy and all of the mysteries, and sort of across all the subgenres, sort of all put together in one body.
Yeah, Tolkien had this thing he wrote about the cauldron of stories, the idea that all these other elements from everything you've read and the traditions go into this, and then you ladle out your own version of it. And then, of course, I would say Alice is definitely her own character. You know, she may have had these seeds in her origins, but I love her as the character she's grown to be. So looking at the Alice Worth series, for those who haven't yet read it, and I'm stressing the yet, it's in the urban fantasy genre. Would you like to give us a little kind of taste of what they will find if they start reading the series?
Sure. My particular world is sort of it's very similar. Alice's world is very similar to our own, with the addition of supernatural and paranormal creatures and beings. So there are shifters and vampires and ghouls and things like that. And so I like my preference on urban fantasy is like our world, but with these interesting twists. Excuse me. I also enjoy urban fantasy that steps much farther away from our own world, like Anne Bishop's The Others series, which is very, very different. So I sort of imagined what would have to change in our world if we suddenly, had these creatures walking among us. And so I envisioned like, well, there would have to be like a federal agency dedicated to sort of tracking, monitoring, and serving as law enforcement, who are set up for interactions with creatures that aren't human, don't think like humans, and aren't vulnerable to the same things that we are. And then sort of just it sort of grew from there. So Alice herself is a mage, so she has magic. She has what I call natural magic, so um, air and earth magic, as well as a few other abilities that kind of develop throughout the series. And she is a private investigator. In my world, a mage private investigator sort of specializes in supernatural and paranormal type mysteries, and almost all of her cases involve solving a supernatural related mystery. She has a ghost sidekick whose name is Malcolm, right?
Yeah.
His name is Malcolm. He is, I mean, he calls himself the comic relief in the partnership. He's a lot of fun. He tends to be a crowd favorite. And
But he's
and then
also in some ways he's her anchor, like he's the one who very much a sort of the conscience in some cases, isn't he? He
yeah, you
corrects
do
her.
definitely see him doing, because Alice had a really, not to spoil anything, but she had a very difficult and traumatic childhood and upbringing, and so there are a lot of times where her reactions are very much shaped by her past, and Malcolm and and a few other characters come in as like her Jiminy Cricket. And I was sort of like, Alice, think about this a little bit. And you see her changing over the course of the books, and adjusting and, becoming a little bit more, well, she calls it a little bit more human. Learning how to interact with others and how to love others and care for others and how to let them care and love her. Um, which is a difficult journey for her, considering she didn't really have that growing up. So each book, they're not designed to be read as standalones. Each book contains its own story, its own mystery, but there are overarching stories. There's a major antagonist that everything is sort of building up to her dealing with. There's storylines that run throughout each book. So although each book has a self-contained mystery for her to solve because she's a PI, you would want to probably start with one and then go forward. It's not, not really designed to be read out of order.
Yeah, she's also in, I wouldn't call it a love triangle, that's the wrong word, because there's another side to it, but she's sort of in the middle of pulls between a shifter friend, a very close friend, lover, but also somebody within the vampire community who's very interested in her, but also the mage community. So there's 3 points. It's not really doesn't
Right,
fit into
and
a
a
triangle.
federal agent is, a federal
Yes.
agent as well.
Oh, there we go.
Sort
So
of it's, there's definitely a romance angle to it, as there is with a lot of urban fantasy, but I definitely I didn't want to get into the love triangle thing
yeah.
too much, but there definitely is a little bit of what's the word? Like there's a like she's trying to find the person who like who completes her, who supports
Mm.
her, who compliments her. That's the word I was looking for. Who compliments her the best. Um, and there's a lot of power plays going on too, as as you would expect with any time that you have you have a like the vampires. They've been hundreds of years old. They're all about the power. They're all about the what can somebody do for me, what benefits me, and that's not necessarily the type of partnership relationship that someone like Alice would be interested in. So I think what I was most interested in is exploring power dynamics in personal relationships, and letting Alice sort of figure out what's the healthiest type of relationship to be
Yeah.
in. One trope in urban fantasy and paranormal romance that I'm less of a fan of is the ones where you have a real like difference in power, and you have one partner asserting that dominance over the other. Um, I mean, I think there's room in any genre for all kinds of types of relationships, but I definitely wanted to focus on a healthier type of relationship. So I think
Mm.
that is an exploration of what's a healthy relationship, what's going to be mutually beneficial, what love really is, as opposed to what can this person do for me? How can they advance my goals? Which isn't to me a healthy relationship.
Yeah. And because you've got a long series that you're working on, that for example, the main central relationship with Sean does become more and more important to the reader as you go on. And I found it really gutting in, I think it's Shadows, where she loses, I think it's not too much of a spoiler to say that loses her memory. I think it's in the blurb, so I'm allowed to say that.
Right, it's on the
And
back of the book. So.
yeah. So it's a reset of her relationship with Sean, but it's absolutely, it's just terrible to see. No, you can't forget all these things you've had. The reader is really involved in that. I thought that was a very good thing to do to a relationship from a craft point of view in the middle of what I might otherwise be. And they lived happily ever after. You want
Right.
to actually keep putting the grit in the relationship so that it can move on and become actually even deeper as a result.
And they they have a lot of ups and downs, as they both kind of adjust to the relationship. And Sean has always wanted, and very much did believe and does believe he wanted an equal. He's not wanting what the rest of the pack wants him to have, which is a very submissive um uh mate partner, who's going to just follow orders. He wanted someone to stand beside him. But that's all well and good in theory until he does get someone who wants to either stand in front of him, or stand beside him, or stand in front of him. And then he's got to try to figure out, exactly what that means. And Alice isn't ever going to be anybody's, she's not going to be bossed around, too. So there's a lot of dynamics there. So you have to put your relationship through some ups and downs, and
Mm.
because I think that's realistic. I don't know any relationship that's all sunshine and roses, from day one. You're going to run into problems. You're going to run into differences of opinion, especially when you have two people who are so kind of set in their ways, you know. So above all, I wanted it to be a realistic series. I want my heroine to be relatable, and realistic. I want the relationships, the mysteries, the drama, it all to feel like all things that make sense, all things that are relatable. Even though it's, there's magic and all sorts of other creatures around, like I still want people to read it and feel like, yeah, this is something that would really happen.
Mm. And just to help people find these books, the title sequence is Heart of, so Heart of
Right.
Malice and so on. And so when I said Shadows, I'm referring to the book called Heart of Shadows. Just if you're Googling it now, that's how to
Mhm.
find them.
Right.
So
It's yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to ask you, when you write, So I'm now going to actually sort of ask you to think about the process. You said there's a long arc you've been working on. Is this something that you sat down and sketched out? So in a drawer, there's the entire plot of the entire series is written down, or are you someone who is a discovery writer? You may have a vague idea, but you write into the dark. How do you approach it?
Oh, annoying answer. A little of both. Um, I definitely sketched it out because I was planning a long series. The current plan is 12 books. It went from 10 to 12. Had to do a little bit of growth because that's the discovery part. You can plan all you want, but characters for me are living things, and so they will do and say things that I didn't see coming, and then you have to work with that. So I definitely sketched out kind of the arc. I have definite plans for like what's the mystery going to be in each book, and then how is that going to relate to I kind of have the I guess three main overarching plot lines. You know, the conflict with the main antagonist, Alice's personal development and growth, and then her personal relationship.
Yeah. So
So I need to
yeah. The
go ahead.
family she builds around her it becomes a kind of story in itself. Who becomes part of that? Her maid family, not the
Mhm.
born family.
Right.
So
The Bourne family is a problem.
yeah, yeah,
So
absolutely, yeah, no problem. So when you set out, I don't know if you can remember what it was like to think it up. Did you start with Alice as your character, or did you come up with a situation and then think who's the character to carry the story?
well, it's kind of it's an interesting, and I do remember actually. I remember the moment it happened. In fact, I was sitting out on my porch. I have this lovely screen porch overlooking a river, and I was sitting out there, and a sentence popped into my head, and it ended up being the first sentence of the blurb of Heart of Malice, or what would become Heart of Malice, which was the first time Moses Murphy's granddaughter killed on his orders, she was 6 years old. That sentence popped into my head. Some people say call it a muse. Some people I don't, that sentence fully formed popped into my head. So I actually met Moses before I met Alice, because in that sentence I started imagining who he was, and then who his granddaughter would be, and it just grew out of that. I envisioned Alice as the granddaughter, and then the whole setup just sort of grew out of that moment. It was a very magical moment.
Absolutely. And also looking at your biography, you have a background in forensic criminology, which seems to me to connect to the Private Eye story. Would I be, because there's quite a lot of detail in a fantasy form of like tracing and uncovering crimes. Is that something that you've picked up from your reading of real world criminology?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think it comes the college courses were an outgrowth of my lifelong fascination with mysteries. Like not just putting the clues together, which I personally find amazing. And Alice is living my dream life as a private investigator. Um, but as an undergrad, I was really seriously interested in pursuing criminal profiling as a career. I would have liked to have gone to work for the FBI, and done that. And so I took a lot of criminal justice courses as an undergrad, and of course I was an English major, so the instructors always thought I had accidentally enrolled in the wrong class. Because they would be looking down their rosters and there would be 100 criminal justice majors and then me, the English major. Um, but I was lucky enough to take courses with all instructors who were actual former or current law enforcement, and a couple of courses with an actual practicing forensic psychologist, whose job it is to go to prisons and secure wards and talk to talk to serial killers and talk to all kinds of people. And so I got to absorb all of that real world knowledge through courses like death investigation and serial killers and forensic psychology. And I ended up not going that route professionally, mainly because as a very empathetic person, I thought it will be too difficult day in and day out, particularly to interact with, family members of people who lost their lives. I just thought that would take too much of a toll on me personally. But it remains a real fascination. And so I feel like I definitely want to use that, in the investigations, as Alice is not just following physical clues, but trying to figure out motivations and understanding not just the how, and the when, but the why of why people do the things they do. Because I think that's a fundamental question that we all ask ourselves, whenever we read about any particular case, is why did this happen? What was this person's motivation? So I want that to be, sort of at the forefront of the stories as well.
I mean, hopefully most people are fortunate enough not to experience this in their own lives. I mean, we all know it's a possibility, but when you don't have it, you can have a certain comfort blanket around you that it's happens to other people. Whereas you're writing a character to whom it has happened. Do you find it a difficult place to go when you're writing Alice and her traumatic backgrounds?
Yes, I really do. I struggled particularly during the writing of Shadows, I will say, because that is, to me, the darkest of the books.
Mm.
A lot happens to her, a lot happens that kind of, you know, uh, calls back to mind, what she went through, during her childhood as she was growing up, after her escape. Um, and while she's been in hiding, not just the darkness of the people that she has to interact with, in that book, which are, sort of the darkest. Um, but I feel like on the one hand, I like tapping into those again, it's about relatability, right? And it's like tapping into fears that I think a lot of us have, that feeling of helplessness, that feeling of wanting to help and protect those around us and not always being able to do that. um and I think that's a lot of what Alice has to go through. And especially like at the end of Heart of Malice, that I won't spoil anything, but the end of that book carries over into the next book because she's struggling with what she witnessed and was a part of. And that's another thing I wanted Alice to be in terms of relatability. I've read some series where the main character goes through really difficult, like she loses someone or she goes through a really traumatic event, and then because she's a strong character, she just goes on as if it doesn't bother her, and that really bugged me because I that's not how we operate as human beings. Like we don't brush things off that easily. So when Alice goes through something, it's you still see the ripple effect, not just in that book but even in subsequent books as she's trying to deal with it.
Yeah,
So I think
also in
okay.
Shadows, you depart from your usual more straightforward timeline orientated plot structure, and you break it up in order to, I suppose it gets a sense of the disorientation, but also it's a way of telling a really difficult story because you have other moments where it's before this is, you don't have a like unrelenting big slab of negativity sitting in the middle, which would have been the alternative. Yeah.
And,
So
from an author's standpoint, that book was a challenge to write, because it was, the first one I wrote where the point of view changes depending on but switches
mm,
back and forth between the 2 main characters, because really that's as I was planning out the book, I was like, that's the only thing that makes sense to tell the story is to have part of the book told by Sean and part of it told by Alice because of what's going on. And then it didn't really work very well when I was planning it out to tell it simply in a linear timeline, because of the things that happen. So I felt like the way I put it together made the most sense to me. And I tried to be very clear with headings and so forth, like where we were in the timeline and who was telling the story and so forth. I really honestly don't think it would have worked very well if I had just told it linearly, and only from Alice's point of view. So it's
so
and it's good as a writer. You want to stretch. you want to stretch yourself from time to time and challenge yourself. And I'd already written in Sean's head, because there's a novella called Just for One Night that retells part of Heart of Malice from Sean's point of view. So I wanted to kind of continue with that and tell part of that story from Sean's perspective, as he's also going through the difficulty of,
Mm.
start almost starting over with Alice, and trying to help her. And I also felt like his impressions of who she was in this particular situation, without all those traumatic memories shaping how she thinks and reacts, I wanted to also get that perspective across, like how he's reacting to this version of Alice.
Mm. I think it's probably possibly my favorite of the series. I don't know. I've enjoyed them all, but when you were contemplating the more complicated series, is there a draft of it where you did try it as a straight through and then you reorganized, or did you plot it out and then write it to
I
that?
like Yeah, during the plotting phase, it became pretty clear that
Okay.
I was going to have to do something a little bit different. It just, just as I was doing my plotting and everything, I thought, if I just tell this linearly, just on a couple of levels, like, you would already know what had happened to her
Yeah.
real
Mm.
early on, instead of it being sort of the mystery that gets revealed, like, "Oh, that's what happened. That's where she was. Okay."
Yeah.
And that's how she turned out that way, and, "Oh, that's where, Malcolm is," and so forth. So, and it just it became pretty clear real early on that I was gonna have to do something a little different.
I'm imagining a great wall of Post-it notes of you moving them around, but maybe maybe you do it on computer, I don't know.
No, I
Um,
definitely do a lot of my plotting on paper. I'm old-fashioned that way. I do all my writing on the computer, and so forth, but, when it's the idea generation time, I have each book has a notebook, a journal, and I write everything out. I feel like I think a little bit better for the idea generation, because I'm a kinetic thinker. I like to move when I think. I like to write, like, longhand. And I also have these lovely notebooks. I have this lovely shelf of notebooks where, each book has a notebook, and I can actually go back and see the earliest versions, the earliest ideas, the things that I had planned but it didn't happen. So I enjoy that on a couple of levels, just to be able to go back and see, um, things that I had originally planned in the book. And then as I was writing, as I said, characters do and say things you don't expect. And so, I had a plan for this to happen, but it didn't happen. Instead, this happened. So it's fun for me to go back and look at that.
do you have any tips for listeners who want to write an urban fantasy on how to do world building?
Um, For me, again, I can only speak to what I did, for me, I started with the characters, and then the world kind of developed around that, because I was thinking, "Okay, I'm gonna have this person my main character is gonna have magic, I know I want to have these certain other creatures. Now, what world do they inhabit? How does that change our world?" Um, and in the Alice series, it's, her world is very similar to ours. There's a few changes. It depends on how far you want to take it. Um, I have I have a spinoff in the works. I guess I can call it a spinoff. It'll stand by itself, but it will be set in what I call the Broken World, which is a world that appears in the
Yeah.
sixth book, Heart of Vengeance. And that world is much different than ours. Um, so to me, I think a lot of people who read urban fantasy, they love the world, they love the worlds, they love the imagination, and I definitely do too. But you also need really real, well-developed people to inhabit that world. So for me, I started with my characters, and then I sort of built the world around them, a world that would challenge them, and a world that I wanted the reader to read that and say, "Oh, that's creative, that's imaginative, that's a neat twist on our world." The wonderful, wonderful thing about fantasy and science fiction too is you're only limited by your own imagination. Um, you can have a setting, you can place your stories anywhere you want to, and have all of these wonderful challenges and difficulties and wonderful backdrops for your characters to play out their dramas. Um, the only caveat to that is that your rules have to make sense, and they should be consistent within that world. So and you don't want to change them from one book to the next. You don't want to have things happen that contradict the foundation that you've established. But other than that, not even the sky's the limit, which is another big reason why I love science fiction and fantasy so much. Just you can do all you can be so creative in how you and in your the backdrop, the environment that you're working in. Do you want to have cities that move and change? Do you want to have the magic that that can transport you from one place to another? uh you know there's no limits to it. I don't know if that
So what
answered your question.
No, it absolutely did. Start with the character and build around. That's the take home for me. Um, so what was your route to publishing like? That's another thing that lots of people are interested in, how to, penetrate the mysteries of getting a book out there.
Oh, for sure. Well, I was lucky that I made contact with a couple of people who had already published books, and so I got some really helpful advice. One of the most important bits of advice I got was to be patient. And like, you feel like when you finish the book, you immediately want to send it out there. You want to get it in and query, and you want to get it out there to people who might publish it. I think one of my biggest pieces of advice is wait and revise. Um, Identify some what we call beta readers, which would be people who are going to read it and give you feedback. Friends and family do not work well for that. You don't want people to read it and say, "This is the best thing I've ever written. Don't change a word." You need someone who's going to give you honest, tough feedback, because that's how it gets better. And I would say, 4 or 5 of those folks, have them read it, get honest feedback. You don't have to change it to make them happy, but if you have more than one person pointing something out, I think that's a pretty good indicator that you may need to rethink that.
Mm.
And so I had some really great beta readers that gave me some very tough love, on that first version of Heart of Malice, which was originally entitled Magic City, in fact. And so it went through a lot of revisions, because when you start querying, you want to send out the best version of that book. You don't want to send out the version you just finished, or even the mildly revised version. It needs to be its best self. And then the second bit of advice I got that was really important was to work on your query, what they call the query letter, but it's actually an email usually. And revise it and revise it and revise it, because that is the single most important thing you will ever write. You can have the world's best book, but you're not sending the book to the agents or the publishers. You're sending your query, and you've got about 1 to 2 short paragraphs to compel them to actually see the book. If you consider that they get hundreds of those a week, a lot of them, the agents and the publishers, how are you going to make yours really stand out and get them to nibble on it? So I worked on mine. I must have revised it, I mean, dozens of times. I had people read it. I actually got in on some contests, and I won a couple of professional critiques of my query letter. You can get in on those on Twitter, is a good place to get in on those. That other authors will run them as well. A lot of times you'll see contests where someone will be giving away a professional critique, and I can't stress enough how important that was. So once you have your book in its best form, you have your query letter, your base query letter in its best form. You start querying publishers and agents, um, and you want to change the letter and adapt it to each agent or publisher. Show them you've read their website. It's not, definitely, you don't want them to know, like, they know, but that you don't want them to really notice that it's a form letter. Like, so you tweak it, and I see that you publish so and so, and my book is very similar to that, or something like that. and make sure to follow their instructions exactly. Because every one of them will ask for something different. Some of them just want the query. Some of them want the query, a one-page summary, and the first 1,000 words. Just do exactly what they say. And then I really credit that my attention to detail on all of that to getting several bites on my hook, if you will, and then getting a publishing contract was, just making sure that I had the best query I could possibly have, and that first chapter sparkled like a vampire in the sun. So that's my advice.
So did you get the bite first from the publisher rather than an agent? Was that your
I
route?
had a couple of bites from a couple of agents and a couple of bites from publishers, and I ended up deciding, at this stage in my career to go directly to a publisher, without an agent, and I have not regretted that. I'm very happy with my publisher. My publisher is City Owl Press. They're a woman-owned press. They specialize in urban fantasy, paranormal romance, contemporary romance, fantasy, and science fiction. So I've been very happy with this press. I'm pretty comfortable advocating for myself, as an author. I do think that down the road, as if my career continues to develop, I will want to get an agent, but at the moment, I'm pretty content.
You probably will have absolutely no difficulty getting an agent whatsoever, because my own experience was I got interest from a publisher first, and then that made it so much easier to walk in through the door of a big London agency, whereas the other way around might have been tricky. But,
Yeah,
you
for sure.
know
And I mean, it's a big gamble on any publisher or any agent's part to sign a debut author.
yeah.
Um, and so, I just I evaluated, what the offers I had in front of me, which I feel so lucky every day to have had that ability. But when I looked at it all, and I did a ton of reading online, of various authors, blogs, and so forth, trying to also get advice from people who've been in this spot, like what should I do? And at that moment, at this point, I felt like just going straight to the publisher. I didn't need an agent, at this moment, but I probably will end up getting one.
Yeah. Well, you've now added to that that good advice that's out there. So I'm hoping people are taking notes even now. Attention to detail. Do what they ask. Don't sort of send in a whole manuscript if they only want 1,000 words. That's just not
Yeah,
going to help.
the general wisdom seems to be like if you don't follow their instructions, they'll just delete it.
Yeah.
You want to show to me, like, think about what is your dream as an author? Like, is your dream to be bestseller? Is it, whatever it is, you following those instructions is how you make that happen. If you don't, if you just send the same form letter with no tweaks, if it's got typos, if it's got if it's not perfect, or at least it's not as good as it can be, you're not going to get that door open.
Mm.
And I think those who do make that happen, I mean, it's a million to one. You can increase your odds the more work you do on the front end. Get that writing sample, whatever it happens to be, the first chapter or the first 3 chapters, your query letter, I can't stress enough, get that critiqued professionally. And then every time, everything you do like that, it just increases your chances even more.
And persist.
Yes, I mean, I definitely, I have a contract. I also got a lot of rejections. I have a spreadsheet because I am I'm that sort of person. I have a massive spreadsheet, of all the places I queried. A lot of them you won't hear back from. They get hundreds of queries a week and they don't have time to email you back. I also got a lot of this isn't for us, but best of luck, sort of emails, and there were a lot of those. There were a lot.
Mm.
But you only you only lose at it if you stop. And you just have to keep going because your stories have an audience. Continue to work on your query letter, continue to work on, your synopsis, your samples. your stories will find their audience, but you just have to keep at it.
Lisa, this has been a wonderful conversation. I suppose we need to know what's next. You've trailed the fact that there's a spin-off series, but what can we look forward to for the rest of this year or early next?
Well, I have 8 books so far. I'm currently writing what I call 8.5, which is a novella that takes a couple of the supporting characters, and they have their own story. I have 4 more Alice books to go. That the one I'm working on now, Mortal Heart, is going to be out in November. And then I have 4 more Alice books, and alternating with those are going to be 3 books featuring a character from the series named Trent Lake, who is going to have a trilogy of his own, and then those 2 timelines will come together for the final Alice book. Once those are done, my plan is to then move on to the Broken World and start that series with a character named Lucy, that you may have met in
Yeah.
Vengeance.
Yes, absolutely. She's got a lot of attitude as well.
I enjoyed Lucy a lot.
Yeah.
I actually started writing on the first Lucy book. I'm gonna wait until Alice is done to really go full out on that. But I enjoy Lucy a lot. I think she's going to be a lot of fun. Her world is definitely much more different from ours, in a lot of really cool, fun ways. So,
Well, it has dragons.
right, yes, it has all kinds of wonderful things. I'm looking forward to it. Um, I think it's going to be a big contrast with Alice's world, and it's a little bit Wild West.
Yeah.
Not literally, but it's a very wild environment. You have all kinds of creatures, you have all kinds of issues, and you've got sort of this um, what they're called the League of Guardians, and that's their job to try to maintain some kind of order in this very crazy world. Um,
You
that
also have the
Lucy
fun thing fun thing that you introduce, like, the alter egos of some of the characters who appear in one world. There's a sort of version of them in a different context in the other, which is huge fun. Like
Right, and I mean, I don't wanna do go too much on that because I feel like you can kind of slip into a little bit of cliches, and, I remember when we were first talking about the book, my editor's like, "You're not gonna make Alice fight herself, right?" I was like, "No, we're not gonna do that." Um, but definitely you get to play around with it. We know at least a couple of, like mirror world, to borrow from Star Trek, the mirror
Yeah.
episodes are Spock gets the beard, right? Mirror world selves. So that one's gonna be a lot of fun. Um, and very distinctly different from Alice.
So to complete the podcast, we always end with where in all the fantasy worlds is best for something. We've
Mhm,
done, sort of things like the best mountains, the best inns, the best food, that kind of thing. And because there is a strong theme of, well, I call them a kind of magical gang, a sort of cabal, which is
mhm,
in Alice's, well, one of the big grits in Alice's sort of oyster.
mhm.
I thought we'd ask, where are the best gangs in science fiction or fantasy? Doesn't matter
Oh,
which.
oh
Where would you?
boy. That is a really good question. Really, I think, for being on the spot here, I think I'm gonna point to, the Kate Daniels series by Ilona Andrews,
Mm,
and specifically, the way that her world is set up. She has, what she calls Masters of the Dead, or they have, I'm sorry, Ilona Andrews is a husband and wife writing team. Um, they have what they call Masters of the Dead. They have people who pilot vampires. It's the most creative presentation of vampires I think I've ever read in any series. So they have the vampires. They have the shifters have a very definite sort of hierarchy, where you have, the top is called the Beast Lord, um, and this sort of each of the different types of creatures has a very definite sort of, I would say coalition, I guess, or you could call it like a gang, or you could call it like a
mm,
power structure. And so a lot of that conflict that happens in the environment in that series is based on the conflicts between, the different types of creatures and their, their structures and their hierarchies, sort of pushing and shoving, trying to get more power in this crazy world that they inhabit.
Yeah, I love those books as well. They're fantastic. You're right. The idea of the vampires there, which is that you can kind of sell your, like selling your body to science at the end. You can sort of help your family out by becoming this piloted vampire. It's just wonderful. It gets away from any of the romanticism of the kind of gentleman vampire.
Yeah, and definitely, the Lord Byron style, suave, sophisticated, pansexual vampire is is sort of the trope that I certainly lean on, as well. But I love these stories where someone can take something that's maybe a little bit overdone and then take it and do something completely new with it. And I just love the way that, and there's also the Mercenary Guild, and there's another, in that series
The
as well.
knights.
Like,
There's also the knights.
right, exactly, yeah, who are incredibly just, the ends justify the means and extremely brutal, and, then you've got sort of the Mercenary Guild that Kate belonged to, um, for a while, and it's like you've got all these different gangs, all these different groups, like, sort of jockeying for power and trying to undercut each other, and it makes for just a wonderful, you just know that you really can't count on anybody, in that world, except for a few people, because everyone is very much looking out for themselves, which makes, of course, which creates a great environment for storytelling. Which, Ilona Andrews, Ilona and Gordon, you will never, you will never not be on your toes reading anything by them, because
Yeah.
the worlds that they create are really outstanding.
Must be fascinating breakfast time conversations between the two of them.
I
Absolutely
cannot
brilliant.
imagine. I know that, right? What an amazing partnership. I've never co-written a book with anyone. I've had discussions about it, but it just seems like they have something incredibly magical happening in that partnership, on multiple levels, to create these incredible stories, these amazing characters. It's just fantastic.
So I think it is quite a difficult place to pick my favorite of all, because I think they're often sort of gangs of people, and I suppose I'm thinking of people who work a little bit outside the law when I'm
Mhm.
thinking of that. So the thing that did come to mind was in the worlds of T.A. White, who actually I talked to fairly recently. But in her Dragon Ridden series, she has a very good depiction of a world where there's sort of circles of power, but one of them is the sort of night market people who exist, have their own very strong power structures, and there's also a sort of acknowledgement that they are needed in society. They're sort of almost there are sometimes raids, but the gangs look after a certain level of society and police it. So I
Mhm.
find that one quite a well thought through gang culture. Um, yeah, so I think that's my pick for this. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for talking to us, and do come back if you've got any new book news to share with us, because we'd love to talk to
I
you about that Broken World series when it starts.
Definitely. Thank you, for having me. My website is lisaedmonds.com. It has information on all the books. It has a couple of fun quizzes. There's a gift shop. There's also my writing blog, which is on the website. So if you're curious to know more about my process, and advice for publishing, it's lisaedmonds.com/blog. And
We'll include a link in the show notes, so people just need to scroll down and they'll be able to find you.
fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. It was a great honor to be on your show.